Hello and good evening. Welcome to Homestage, and we'll get the advert out of the way very quickly. Homestage, in case you were wondering, Homestage are here to support artists during COVID and give them places to, excuse me one second, turn that off, and give them places to perform. One of them you just heard, which was Robbie Nash. Thank you, Robbie, for the introduction. I've had the great pleasure for the last 2 or 3 weeks of working with Burge and putting this together. And I have to say that she's amazingly inventive, I've discovered, imaginative, hugely energetic, and that all comes through in her poetry. You're going to have a great evening. I've loved putting it together. I hope you enjoy it. So Sue, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you so much for inviting me to do a reading for Homestage.
I don't know if you can hear me, Sue, but you're muted at the moment. Seems to be. Unless I was. Anyway.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Great, okay. So sorry about that. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to create this event for Homestage. I thought I'd just start by just saying how I got into poetry before I read the first few poems from my first collection. And I've always written poetry. The first poem I remember writing was a dreadful one on James Bond that rhymed, but it actually got into the local newspaper. I was 9 years old and thought that was it, thought I was a proper poet. But it wasn't until about 30 years later that I actually started taking poetry seriously. I've been writing really seriously for the last 20 years. And one of my huge interests is film. I'm a film studies tutor as well as a creative writing tutor. And I do find that film and poetry do have a lot of similarities. Looking at the way a film is put together and the way a poem is put together seem very similar to me. The way you cut and curate a poem really affects the meaning. So I think one of the things about being a poet is that you start writing and you don't realize until you're quite a way in that you've actually got enough poems for a collection, and that the poems that you're writing are starting to kind of have a dialogue with each other and make a body of work. And it was only about probably 7 or 8 years ago that I started to feel that, and I was very lucky to have my first collection picked up by Live Canal. My first collection is in the Kingdom of Shadows, and this sort of brought together my love of film, especially German expressionism and black and white film, and my love of words at the same time. I taught English and literature and creative writing at the University of East Anglia. So I'm going to read a few poems from In the Kingdom of Shadows. Why is it called In the Kingdom of Shadows? Because I came across this brilliant quote by Maxim Gorky. And in 1896, he saw his first film at one of the very early public showings of moving pictures. And he said, "Last night I was in the Kingdom of Shadows." And that's always stayed with me, that quote. I really enjoy liminal spaces, being kind of in between worlds and thinking about the idea of silent films. Everyone you see on silent films is now a ghost. They're dead, they are no more. And that's quite a sort of spooky thought to have. So I wanted to bring a lot of those ideas of past lives and liminal spaces into this collection. So I'm going to start with a poem called Gothic, which was particularly inspired by films like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, so very early, you know, just edging into the 1920s. Gothic. A girl, her dress a blank canvas for long fingered shadow stains. A bed, draped, tucked with the coolness of scented cotton. Under, decay, blooming like a ripening bruise. A man, noctambulant, walks a tightrope between two lives. Shadows, forged by the lamplighter, undulate like a swirled cloak, finding the cracks of a world stitched together too many times. A garden, walls smooth and straight as a tomb, the earth beneath sown with broken fingernails. And me, caught in the projector's dancing beam, lips parted, wanting it dark, dark, dark. So the second poem is called Doppelganger, and that kind of idea of the double is a very key idea in those 1920s German expressionist films. But this is about that moment when a bird crashes into your window and leaves that weird kind of dusty imprint. Doppelganger. A thud, and we wake to see the splay of an owl across the window. There is no other trace of him, just this powdery impression, like moth dust. We marvel at the detail of it, the narrative force, how he came at speed, wings open, how he must now be skulking somewhere in the cold woods, cloaked in darkness and betrayal. This ashy presence is with us over Christmas until the January storms reduce it to smudge. Sometimes we hear him mourning, see a brief pale flit beyond the larches, put our cheeks against the cool glass, remember our time with his still and lovely twin.
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second, Sue. Thank you so much. That's absolutely gorgeous. To remind people that there's a chat function that they can use. And please do send in observations, questions, anything that has got you thinking, and we'll stop every 3 or 4 poems and have a chat with people and a bit of a question and answer session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So I've also been very lucky in that I did quite a lot of international marketing for my department. I was partly in charge of recruiting international students to the University of East Anglia. And I've always travelled for pleasure anyway, but I was so lucky to have these work trips too, which gives you a different insight into a country when you meet agents and do international markets. You just meet people and find out about different places. And I was really lucky that I discovered this brilliant hotel in Berlin called the Pension Funk. And it was where Asta Nielsen, who was a Danish film star, used to live. And although she was Danish, because it was in the silent era, it didn't really matter what she was speaking on screen because there'd be intertitles. And she was actually really popular in Germany as an actress and internationally as well. She's most famous for playing Hamlet. So she had very early female taking the role of Hamlet incidents. And this poem is called Moments of Sleeping and Waking, Pension Funk, Berlin. It was quite a creepy place. It was full of kind of red velvet and black and white photos of Asta Nielsen, very kind of set in its 1920s time, a bit frozen, really. And it was lots of dark furniture in the rooms. It was quite a creepy place to sleep. So it's not surprising that I wrote this poem, really. Moments of Sleeping and Waking, Pension Funk, Berlin. Clouds unfurl from the tatters of a stormy day. I drift away, a fish afloat in the protective net of night. I sleep beyond the ticking of the clock until a slammed door shakes me upright, face to face with Asta Nielsen, dressed as Hamlet, silently declaiming to be or not to be in Danish. Then back to the smell of moths eating their way through a worn red velvet world. German sunlight wakes me from an English dream, where I'm trapped like Scott in a shroud of snow, and I forget to notice you're not there, or to wonder why we ever slept through a third of our time together. I also discovered when I was sort of teaching and researching silent film, I became rather entranced with documentary films from the silent era. And one of the ones I grew to love was Great White Silence, Herbert Ponting's wonderful documentary of the fateful Antarctic expedition with Scott. I was very lucky to have a short residency in the Cambridge Polar Research Institute, which meant that I got taken behind the scenes. I got to handle bits and pieces from various cultures from the North and South Poles. I also had a look at some artifacts from the Scott expedition. There are some wonderful letters tucked away. And I came to write this poem, What Scott Knew, as a basis of that residency. And I like to think this is a bit of a fragment of a diary that might be found frozen in the snow one day. What Scott Knew. 1. Frostnip, the topmost stratum of skin nibbled away. 2. Frostbite, when more layers freeze, the blood too dulled to reach our dying cells. From this there is no return, only further loss. Our blackened faces staring back like Ponting's negatives, in which we smile closed smiles, reluctant to reveal our teeth, cracked like garden pots, attacked by frost. 3. That even my dreams of English gardens are shock frozen, colours leached from memory, a nightly journey towards optophobia, the fear of opening one's eyes, seeing only whiteness. 5. That the dogs will lick their yellow snow like lemon sorbet or panting ecstasy and ice-spiked fur. 6. That the sun glows like a low candle in a vaulted chapel. 7. That my snow-blind eyeballs see only a mirage of insectless sastrugi shimmering like sand dunes. 8. That the spans of all our seal-skinned arms together are not enough to embrace this great white silence. 9. There are so many words for snow, and all of them are cursed. There will never be a 10. We are unfinished in the eyes of our frozen Lord. So that's the... Tom, I can't hear you.
You can now. I've switched
There
myself
you
on.
are.
Dave, I'm carried away, you see. I'm just concentrating on the poetry, forgetting about everything else. That was stunning. That was what I was trying to say, and it was stunning. We've got, I'm afraid, questions pouring in, so
Fantastic.
I'm not going to be able to ask all of these. So to those of you that are missing out, I'm so sorry, but we're not going to get through the poetry if we get stuck on all the questions. But George, he is asking a question about, well, first of all, he says, thank you very much, Sue. And to him, he says that Gothic, it represents, he says, zombies. He loves the notion of the Victorian lamplighter and the idea of shadows falling between cracks in the world is horrific. Gardens is the tomb, and the audience just wants to be scared. I get it. So
fantastic. Great. Thank you, George.
But that's how I felt too, I have to say. A simple question from Kim on doppelganger is, if doppelgangers can be a ghostly presence or a harbinger of bad luck, or as an alternative, a lookalike, she didn't quite get how, which of those the doppelganger is in Doppelganger.
Yeah, I suppose it's thinking that the owl leaves its presence behind. It leaves its kind of alter ego behind in that imprint on the window. So it's got a kind of alter ego, a double, that's been left, and it's gone off, leaving part of itself behind, which I find quite creepy. I mean, owls can be quite creepy anyway. They often foretell death. But that added layer of the splayed kind of dust on the window was the idea I was trying to get across. The owl and its double, basically.
Yeah, no, it absolutely falls into place. I didn't get it either. So Kim, you're not alone.
I think that's the thing with poetry, that I'm not trying to encourage people to buy my books, ho ho ho, but I think if you can read them on the page several times, they just mean something more every time. I find that I read a lot of poetry, and I go to a lot of workshops, and I find that the more I read a single poem, the more I fall into the world of the poem. It's really tough just hearing something the first time. So yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. On the moments of sleeping and waking, this is one of the best descriptions of being asleep that I've heard. I love beyond the ticking of the clock and smell of the moths. It's an extraordinary account of a dream. Thank you very much, Sue. That's by Richard. And then Rachel on Scott, optophobian. I now know exactly what that means. Like Scott, I wouldn't be able to open my eyes.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure there are different shades of whiteness, but it must have been such a strange world, a kind of black and white world.
Yeah. And actually, there's another comment very similar to that. Just congratulating you on just collecting this whole Antarctic sense. Have you been to the Antarctic?
No, I haven't.
Is it all wonderfully imaginative?
Yeah, I'd kind of love to go, but in a way I wouldn't. It's so strong in my imagination. That in a way I just quite like to keep it in the world of that wonderful 1912 silent film, which is just magical, and you can easily get a copy of that. So I'd recommend that to anybody.
Did it all come from the film, or did you, I imagine you spending hours researching and getting under the skin of Scott?
Yeah, I did do quite a lot of research, but I think watching the film again and again, it's such a brilliant documentary, and you see more and more, a bit like a poem. The more you watch the film, the more you see the expressions and you know, the degradation of the features, because, you know, everything's kind of, I guess they were suffering from malnutrition and all sorts of weird things going on with their bodies. So, yeah.
I think if we get time later on towards the end and when you've finished reading the poetry, which is what we're here for, so that's what we'll get on and do, but it would be very interesting to hear from you the different experiences that you have when writing. You know, how long can one take versus how quickly can something else be brought together. But we'll come back to that later on if we get the time.
Sure.
So I think, Paul, we are on with the evening, are we not?
So I'm going to read a few poems from my second book, Lumiere. Actually, I say second book, but this came out pretty much at the same time as In the Kingdom of Shadows. Lumiere was the result of another residency. I was so lucky to receive an Arts Council grant in 2016. And really, my sort of stronger journey as a poet had started the year before. I went to a week-long masterclass at Tynudd, which is a wonderful residential centre in Wales. And I was with Maura Dooley and Gillian Clark and some amazing poets who I'm still in touch with for a week. And it was so validating. I felt like a proper writer. I was surrounded by such committed people. And it really changed my view of myself as a writer. I thought, yes, this is what I want to be more than I am at the moment. And then a year later, I got this Arts Council grant, which enabled me to go to Paris for 6 weeks and immerse myself in the streets of Paris. My brief was to write poems in response to films that had been shot either on location in Paris or in the studio, but were set in Paris. So as you can imagine, I had just the most amazing time visiting locations. I met some wonderful people. But I was also very aware that I was there after the Paris attacks, and I'd walked past the Bataclan and seen all the flowers in front of it, which was where all the young people were killed who'd been to the rock concert. So I started my whole collection of Lumiere with this idea of the perfect table. I'd met a poet friend, and it was a lovely sunny April day. And this friend just didn't want to sit outside on the terrace, wanted to sit inside. And it really brought home to me how that Parisian terrace cafe life had been at least put on pause because many people were shot on terraces in cafes during the Paris attacks. But I also was thinking about the fact that it's a writer's cliche, isn't it, to actually sit in a Paris cafe with your pen and your notebook, watching the world go by and writing. And that is, of course, what I did a lot of the time as well. So the book starts with this poem, which isn't in the body of the pamphlet, but is at the beginning. The perfect table is in a cafe in Paris, by a steep and spiky canal bridge. It is inside, for there's more to fear today than nicotine and rain. The perfect table does not have a cloth. Its surface is brailed with before. proposals, breakups, philosophy. The perfect table cradles my elbows. The fold of my knees understands the stutter in my heart, on my lips. The perfect table asks nothing of me, holds my words, my deep, dark coffee. One of the first poems I wrote, I was so excited to go over to Paris. It's a place I love. I'd lived there and worked there in the past as an 18-year-old, and then in my mid-20s. My degree is in French. I'm obsessed with French film to a ridiculous degree. And I was so excited that I actually wrote this poem, Blue, in the under the channel in the Eurostar. It just sort of came out. And thinking about process, everybody's so individual when it comes to writing, but my process seems to be to walk and think and mull and research. And by the time I put pen to paper, the poem's pretty well done in my head. I don't do many drafts. I have poet friends who do loads of drafts, and you just sit and beaver away at their drafts. But I tend to do my drafting in my head. And this is called Blue. And it's based on Krzysztof Kieślowski's trilogy of films, Red, White and Blue. And in this one, the wonderful Juliette Binoche is overwhelmed with grief. She's survived a crash which killed her child and husband. And to try and manage her grief, she swims every day at the pool in the Rue de Pontoise, just off the Boulevard Saint-Germain. And there's this amazing scene in the film of her holding a sugar lump in a coffee cup, just watching coffee seep up. So I was trying to sort of contain the idea of grief in that image. Blue. Her head is full of blue, like cotton wool, as she draws her body through the pool at Pontoise. After, in the cafe, the shadow on her face takes the shape of a cupped hand. Music bleeds into the stillness around her as she tilts a sugar cube to the brim of her coffee, watches the soft seep rise, a spreading stain, unstoppable, although the span of her finger and thumb holds the shape for as long as she is able. Now drink, she thinks, just drink. This is what normal people do.
I'm just going to, people are getting so fed up with me because I'm going to interrupting, but it's when they bother to send some inquisitive and thought-provoking messages across, and this seemed too good a one to miss. And it is that here could be a story of either failure or immense achievement on the road to rebuilding, which I felt, to me, it said that as well. That was Alice's thought. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Alice. That's a lovely thought. It's so hard to, when you're writing inspired by film, to make the poem stand alone from the film so that the reader doesn't have to see the film to get some kind of feeling and world from the poem. So thank you, Alice. That's just what I was trying to get across. This poem, I did carry on writing quite a long time after I came back from Paris, partly because it takes so long to get published. And it took me a couple of years to find a publisher for this collection. So I kept adding to it. And I heard about a woman called Erica, who had a fetish about monuments. And she actually married the Eiffel Tower in a civil ceremony, having previously had a relationship with the Berlin Wall. And I thought, I have just got to write about this woman. I can't remember her surname. I think she was an ex-American soldier. And she did actually take the name Eiffel, so she's Erica Eiffel. So this is called Madame de la Tour. I tell you, there's a woman so in love with the Eiffel Tower, she's married it. You roll your eyes, ask Google, and there she is. I envy her giddy gaze, her parted lips, the tender way she holds her iron groom. You tell me Zola feared the tower's height would bring more storms to Paris. I imagine King Kong swinging over the cowed city, lightning forking round his melancholic roars. I don't love the tower, but I like how it appears from nowhere, playing a game of hide and seek, punching the sky, always a winner. I wonder if there'll be room for more wives, nesting on different platforms like plump doves, the bitter taste of metal fading on their tongues, cooing as they watch spirals of tourists, queuing like starstruck autograph hunters at the stage door. And the next one shows how poets suffer for their art. I wanted to write a poem about Audrey Hepburn, and I wanted it to include chocolate. So I went on a 3-hour chocolate tasting tour in Paris, which was hell, as you can imagine. Actually, I ate so much chocolate, I ended up sitting on the pavement with my head between my legs because I felt a bit sick. So I did suffer, but it was also an amazing experience, and this is the result. Audrey Hepburn in Paris. Audrey, excuse me, Audrey is doing a day without Givenchy. Capri pants, Breton top, chignon, sunglasses, flats. Flesh and bones whittled by years of starvation. She knows she can indulge, feel the sticky squeeze of a macaron between finger and thumb, down it in one like an oyster. In a bookshop, a youth plays violent music on a protesting piano. Audrey takes a square of dark chocolate, crafted from cocoa beans grown on volcanic lava. It is like eating a single malt. She can't remember if she's filming Charade with Gregory Peck or Paris when it sizzles with William Holden. N'importe, she shrugs, savouring a square from a chocolatier whose cocoa grows on ancient mango plantations. The citrus zing pounces at the back of her throat like a sob in reverse. Audrey is obsessed with the culture of chocolate, how Queen Maria Theresa's favourite recipe for chocolat chaud used rose petals from Alexandria, how the Mexicans placed cocoa beans round tombs to nourish the dead, give them currency in the afterlife, how once you could buy a slave for 100 beans. Audrey lifts a two-handled trembleuse to hot coral lips. She hopes all this will give her enough weight to face the succubus pull of the camera. So this final poem from Lumière is called Skimming Stones on the Canal Saint-Martin. And it's partly based on a scene from Amélie, the wonderful film starring Audrey Tautou, who based her look very much on Audrey Hepburn. In it, I mention an actress called Arletty, and she's one of my favourite French actresses. She was really popular in the 30s and the 40s, and she always played the feisty tart with a heart of gold. She went out of favour during the occupation of Paris, and actually once the occupation was over, she was tried as a collaboratrice, a collaborator, because she'd been having an affair with a Luftwaffe captain. But her address to the judge has gone down in history. She said, "Mon cœur est français, monsieur le juge, mais mon cul est international." Basically, my heart is French, Your Honour, but my ass is international. So she was a wonderful, feisty actress. And I mention the Hôtel du Nord, which is one of the famous films that she was in, and is also a hotel alongside the Canal Saint-Martin that you saw in that wonderful musical interlude. They couldn't get permission to film on the actual canal. So this brilliant set designer, Alexander Trauner, created a duplicate of the Canal Saint-Martin with a working lock and boats at the studios in Billancourt. So, skimming stones on the Canal Saint-Martin. First, find the flattest stone, the one that fits the scoop of your palm. Buff it to an ebony shine on the stiff wool of your skirt. Squint out your trajectory from your favourite spot. Skim and bounce, low and fast as a landing mallard. When the scuffed water has calmed, check the lonely jigsaw of your face is still complete. Imagine all the long-gone bridges, the one opposite the Hôtel du Nord, where Arletty stamped her foot and cried, "Atmosphère, atmosphère," and the one where the lovers met, once in black and once in white. See the sun smearing the surface like rust, rising from the silted twists of bicycles, mottled knives, prams, bullets, trolleys, bayonets. Ask yourself what you can add to this stone skimmer. Watch your dark cairn rising through the scum, slow, slow as mud. Tom, you're muted, I think.
I keep telling you, my mind's completely off running this thing and entirely focused on your poetry. How can I be expected to concentrate on technology?
That's the greatest compliment you can pay me, thank you.
I refuse to be sucked into technological things when there's so much enjoyment to be had. Here's just a few things that people have said, and I repeat what I said earlier on. There's too many for me to read them all out. We won't get through it all. But Jeffrey, hi Sue, looking forward to this, was from earlier on. And Mark Chamberlain, hello Sue and all. John Sullivan, I'm getting this. Mary, I echo Jeff, looking forward to hearing. Tamsin, this is absolutely great. Steel Cityman, enriched my hospital ward tonight. Isn't that nice?
Fantastic.
And Sue from Leamington Spa, she is, I gather, your doppelganger, first name and a poet.
I see doppelganger.
Lovely to see the poems displayed. Well, that's nice. Words as smooth as chocolate. Florrie says, it's so interesting to hear you talk about your influence from French film. Do you ever find your writing style influenced by French poetry too?
Yes, that's interesting. I think influenced by, yes, definitely influenced by French poetry. In that I walk a lot in Paris and do that kind of Baudelaire thing of observing and writing those kind of flaneur poems. So I was very influenced by Baudelaire when I was over there. And yeah, I find poetry in translation is such a tricky thing. I want to read the poems in the original French, but I also, I can't remember who it was. Was it Robert Frost who said, what gets lost in translation is poetry? So I always worry that I'm missing something. So I tend to read more, I suppose, poems by people who've been in France and been influenced by the French atmosphere, which perhaps ties in with my sort of English take on French life a bit more. But interesting question, yeah.
Tamsin, I'm just loving this reading. Such beautiful words and lilting voice.
Oh, thank you, Tamsin.
Florrie, I think the line citrus zine pounces at the back of her throat like a sob in reverse is just so excellent. I agree with that too. And well, we're not going to finish if I read the rest right now. See how much time we've got at the end.
Okay.
So we'll carry on.
Great, thank you, Tom. So to the latest book that's come out, the Saltwater Diaries, which came out in the autumn. And 3 years ago, I moved to East Runton, which is just outside Cromer on the North Norfolk coast. And I've lived in East Anglia for more of my life than I've lived in other places. So I've explored the coast here in minute detail. I've walked every bit of it. And I love walking coast paths when I'm on holiday. So I've got what I feel is a very strong relationship with the sea. And as soon as I moved here, I didn't really question what my next theme would be. It just seemed to be the sea got more into my blood, and I started writing more and more about the sea and salt, but also the inland environment, the landscape just inland from the sea. And the result was the Saltwater Diaries. I started sea swimming as well, so there's quite a lot about me being in the sea, which is often where I get lines coming into my head. Haven't quite mastered waterproof notebooks yet, but there is a wonderful poet who has, called Anna Selby, so I'm going to get some tips from her. And I wanted to start this final section with a poem called Black Shuck. And Black Shuck is the hellhound who races round the North Norfolk coast, terrorising the inhabitants, keeping them at home on dark nights, probably when smuggling is taking place. He's a bit of propaganda, I think. But he's also the hellhound who inspired Arthur Conan Doyle, who stayed in Cromer Hall quite nearby and heard about Black Shuck. Black Shuck. It begins with the call of flint on stone, the sand ablaze in the sinking light. A black dog, thin as shadow, sniffs the shoreline. Salt contorts his muzzle into snarl and fang. It begins with a storyteller, lean and lank, scavenging the land for new words to spin. The black dog, thin as sea-washed bone, and a woman lamenting her man, gone a year to the day. It ends with claw marks on a church door, a black dog, thin as the whip of the devil's tail, eyes like Baltic amber, salt spun, ribs curved like the shattered hulls he howls to the shore. A black dog, wearing his hunger like a shroud. And if you see Black Shuck, it's supposed to mean that within a year you will die. So I'm going to read the title poem of Saltwater Diaries, All these books are available from me, signed, so you can just go to my website, which will appear magically at the end of this reading. Saltwater Diaries, this is a little beach comb of a poem, so they're fragments, but they do tie together into a whole. The Saltwater Diaries. Some days I leave my other self, sealed in my aunt's liver-spotted mirror, and come here to explore the wreck's dark ribs, where I meet a faceless man searching for a shoreless land. Once he discovered a boat full of ballast, added his weight, sailed the warp and weft of the known seas. I had a floor, the colour of damp sand. When I walked across it, my toes puckered. Storm warning, beach huts collapse like movie props, and beached on the sand there's a whale who turned left instead of right. Miranda, storm child, eyes full of spells, here she is, drawing Ferdinand's lovesick mouth down to her saltiness, twice breached, as Prospero weeps, reads enchanted pages, rippling like kelp, and Caliban folds himself into a mud hole, waiting for her lust to darken once more. I sew you a letter in a pouch cut from dead fishermen's trousers. Dear ocean, my face pressed against the cold slippage of the window, the shudder of distant thunder. My letterbox is full of junk mail about Dramamine, Benadryl, flood insurance. I shimmy into my indigo ball gown, play hide and seek with my tail. My skin leaks. I wake to the doormat's wet spikes, salt stains raging down the door panels. It takes hours for the brine to reach my eyes, to fill my open mouth with the world's salt. And the next one is called Lure, and it's one of the first ones I wrote after I moved. Lure. The windows had been weeping for hours. I head for the rain-pocked sand, watch a matinee of dog walkers. I want to write your name in stones, to draw a shaky heart around something my tongue has lost. The ebbing tide pulls at the salt in my blood. The sea knows I'm just a formula, H2O with a pinch of salt that's learnt to walk. Today, I'm only half an equation. Sometimes I wonder if it's you calling me, your saltiness leaving tide marks on my skin. Or is it the sea who wants me to put on my tail, slice open my fins, slide back in? And I'm going to finish with an inland poem to have a break from the sea. It's called What Is It About Trees That Makes Me Want to Cry? You once told me about an apple tree your father planted on the day of your birth. I want to find that tree, celebrate its regular deaths, applaud how it shrugs leaves like a snake shedding skin, its dormant sap. Long ago, an elm fell behind me with a long, rasping sigh of displacement, a sound that would have made Archimedes shout Eureka. The friend I was with said she was elsewhere, but her fingerprints prove otherwise. I love the certainty of twigs, the chemical greenness of new growth, the unassailability of roots, the bitterness of bark. I love touching the Judas tree, how it hemorrhages purple blossom like traitor's blood. Your latest Instagram post is of snowfall crushing the trees in a temple garden. I imagine how they will feed on its thaw, heal. I realize I love your apple tree best in winter, for the space in between it leaves for me, how its monochrome outline cannot rustle or whisper behind my back. The tree I fear most has a message carved thigh-high to an adult by a boy who died before he learnt to write. At night I wear my crown of thorns, dream of chainsaws and axes, of muntjacs sniffing at trunkless trees. I want to ask the trees if they are scared of the dark. I imagine Anna and Vronsky meeting, fur-trimmed, by a grove of silver birch, making frantic, frost-forged declarations. This morning, a nest fell at my feet, 7 freckled eggs, 1 for every month you've been gone. Thank you.
Wow. And by the way, it is no reflection on your poetry that this time I've remembered to unmute myself.
Good.
It's got better and better. I've just managed to discipline myself to do what I'm here to do. So just to warn you, we're going to ask you for an encore before we let you go.
Oh,
so
okay.
Be thinking about what that might be. In the meantime, we're piling up with more questions and comments. Love the Paris poems, but the sea poems even more. Have all your books, and great to hear you read them. And Sarah has sent lots of emojis, which I can't quite work out what they are, but I'm sure they're very complimentary.
Lovely.
Jeffrey has said encore, and there you are, Jeffrey. We thought about that. Stunning. Thank you so much. I'm just loving this reading. Such beautiful, etc. Wonderful to discover you, Marianne. There's Mary. Stunning. Joe, and this is on Saltwater Diaries. Enchanted pages rippling like kelp. What wonderful lines. And John, I think he probably lives in this part of the world because he says you've captured Weybourne. So was he right as it happens?
Well, I have written quite a lot in the Weybourne area. So yeah, John, you're spot on actually. Yes. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. There's a question, if I'm allowed to ask one.
Of course.
Which I'd like to ask. And it's not about the hang on, here's John saying, I love the line asking the trees if they are afraid of the dark, especially with HS2 threatening them.
Oh yes, exactly. Yes.
I mean, this is I know poetry should be thought-provoking, and it should be like an onion, and you keep sort of taking layers off. And there's more and more underneath, but it all should be wonderful entertainment, perhaps, which it absolutely is and has been, and I've loved it. The question I had was, and it's about the construction of poetry, and we have 2 poetry clubs that get together, and there's a raging argument going on about free verse versus a sort of a trained poetic background, the academia, if you like, of poetry, and the one camp that says you can't be a good poet if you've been trained because it won't let all the good stuff out, and the other saying, well, actually, you need to learn it all and then you'll be even better. Where do you stand on that?
Oh gosh, that's a really difficult one. I'm kind of, I always think of Picasso when I'm asked this question, because Picasso was an absolutely brilliant draftsman. He was a brilliant technical artist. He knew everything there was to know about putting a drawing together or a painting together. But then he went out of that books and experimented and invented new forms, and did something completely different. So I think both do work. I personally don't write formally. I admire poetry that uses rhyme, that uses formal structures, the sonnet structure with the beautiful turn, the wonderful tight rhymes and the syllable count. But for me, that doesn't enable me to express what I want to say. So I'm very much verging at the moment, I suppose, on a more experimental way of writing, but writing in a free kind of contemporary way. But there's a place for both, definitely, and both take different skills and both inform each other. I learn a lot by reading very tightly written formal poetry. It gives me an ear for rhythm and language, which I wouldn't have otherwise. So again, that kind of Picasso idea of you have to learn it all first, and then kind of just find your own place. So I'm quite happy with both camps, but I belong particularly to one and admire the other greatly. Would be, does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And would you describe it as sort of prose poetry? Is that a fair description?
Prose poetry is a little bit different. Prose poetry is a way of showing poetry on the page. So it looks like prose, but when you hear it read, it actually reads like poetry. So good poetry should never sound like prose. It should always sound like poetry. Very crafted language using all the poetic techniques. But it can look on the page in a block, and that would then be a prose poem. But free verse is, it's using words, but it's the line breaks, the way that the lines break all the way through, and the way that language is used as a mode of transformation, like alchemy, to hopefully help the reader see the world in a different way, in a transformed way, and have a different vision of the world. So to me, that's what poetry does.
I can see no end to the arguments in Poetry Club, so that's great. We've got lots to talk about.
Yeah, they happen outside Poetry Club as well.
Can we have your encore? That would be marvellous.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to read a poem called Bryce, which is very dear to me because it's about a very dear friend. This is in the Kingdom of Shadows, but it's also the poem that's inspired my next collection. So my second full collection, Confetti Dancers, is coming out in May with Live Cannon. And one of the sections of that looks at the decimation of the dance world in the UK because of the AIDS pandemic. And the AIDS pandemic was just a tragedy. Those of you who are watching It's a Sin, Russell Davies' new series, will be back in that world. I was working at the Royal Academy of Dancing in the 1980s, and a very dear friend of mine who was a choreologist, a dance notator, was one of the first people in the UK to die from the AIDS virus. And I wrote this poem for him. It took me 30 years to be able to write it. And the quilt I mention in it is part of the Names Project in San Francisco, where they try and do a square of the quilt for every victim of the pandemic. Bryce. I learn this quilt will contain 100,000 unknown names. All 42 of my facial muscles try not to cry as I stitch the memory of the day you showed me your arms bejeweled with sarcoma. How I felt the stutter of your dancing heartbeat. I reimagine you flying home to die in the Australian sun, while we mourned among the cold grey bricks of Rotherhithe. Then the others too were claimed, one by one, long and slow and cruel as purgatory. I honour your name in thread the colour of sunlight, whispering all the news of all the years you never knew me. So sorry, it's not a very uplifting one to end on, but it's probably the one that's most important to me. So thank you for listening, everybody. And thank you, Tom and Paul and Amelia, for all your wonderful support.
Well, I'm not going to let you go without giving you just a few more accolades, because they're here. And it says, could we please have Sue back sometime soon? I second that. Loved it all, says Anne. Jeffrey has started a whole conversation here, which actually I'm going to email you about and then share it with him, because it's all about the move from urban to natural. And I'm fascinated with how that's affected your writing. I asked my tree, says Marianne, if it's afraid of the dark, and it said yes, because I'm in love with the dark.
Oh,
which is rather lovely. And can I just say that for me personally, it's been an utter pleasure to work with you over the last 3 weeks. And you've done us proud by a mile, which isn't very poetic, but it's how I feel.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
I'm utterly moved by what I've heard, what we've seen, and how I now see into your poetry in a way that, as you said quite rightly earlier on, you've got to do it 3 or 4 times to get there. So I'm encouraging everybody to, not because I want them to buy your book necessarily, but for their own sake, to understand how these poems absolutely fall into wonderful pieces that you can put back together in your own way, then read them and read them again. So thank you so much. I've had a wonderful evening. I'm sure everybody else has. And I hope that we'll be able to get you again.
Thank you, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure. And do thank the 2 people who did the wonderful musical interludes as well.
3, actually, there were.
3, yes, at the beginning as well. Yes.
Yeah, Trisha, Joan and Robbie. And thank you to all of them from the folk clubs. Okay, good night all.
Good night, everyone.